Hello everyone and welcome to another YouTube video. Now, a couple of videos ago I did a series where I did a chess.com puzzle rush survival run and I divided that into three parts. And what I did was I went through a series of puzzles of increasing difficulty and I explained my solutions step by step from what I saw when I first looked at the position to the thought process that led me to the solution. That series was very well received. Now, I thought about continuing it, but the problems that we had reached are already of such a high level that it would be a little bit impractical for me to do it in a video and make it accessible to everybody and instructive. So what I decided to do in lieu of that is a video where I basically solve 5 or 6 problems in the rating range between approximately 2200 to 2400, which is a rating range of puzzles that a lot of people have told me they struggle with. So they're able to solve problems, on the 2000 level, but when it gets to this master level, a lot of the problems stump a lot of players. And I'm basically going to apply the exact same approach. I'm going to go through approximately 5 of these puzzles, and I'm going to explain step by step the process that leads me to solving them. And hopefully, while I'm at it, share some advice about finding tactics in general, because we're doing all of this for the sake of practical improvement. The one thing I wanted to remind you of is that if you do have a board lying around, some of these puzzles are very involved and they feature long variations. So it's important, if you want to follow along, to reproduce every puzzle on your board. And while I will try to make things very clear and easy to follow, sometimes the lines are long and you're welcome to make those moves on the board. Without further ado, notice that I'm using chess.com's fantastic learning feature to categorize the problems and frame them within my desired rating range. Let us begin. Now, we have a position here. What can we observe immediately about it? Well, we have basically a bunch of pieces massed on the king side. Black has just played f6, a move with a pawn in front of his king, which by definition weakens the position of his king. Let's try to take that a little bit further. How does it weaken the position of his king? Well, it does weaken the a2 g8 diagonal, right? Can we exploit that? Well, I noticed this queen. Actually, I can play queen a2 check. Okay, so that is a check. There is nothing effective to block that diagonal with. Remember, there's 2 fundamental ways to defend against check. You can intercept the check, or you can move the king. That's a decent, well, you can capture the piece that's giving the check, but hopefully you don't do too much to that. So the king has to move to h8. And here I notice that the king on h8 has no way back. The queen is guarding the g8 square. So if we open up the h file, that's going to be checkmate. We can go rook h3. So a lot of people I know will be tempted by knight f7 check. But the issue there is he's not going to go into smothered mate. He's going to take that knight. And remember, white's king is also very exposed. So that doesn't look like any good. Now what we can do after queen a2, king h8 is actually give a check with a knight on g6. Ooh. And that does exactly what we want it to. It opens up the h file, and we can deliver the checkmate on h3 with a rook. So the key here is that I asked myself how his last move weakened the king. Specifically, rather than just saying it weakened it, I say, how does it weaken it? Well, it opens up the diagonal. Can I exploit the diagonal? Yes, I can. Whew. Here we have another situation of a very, very weak king. And again, rather than getting overwhelmed, let's try to decompose the sort of individual elements that weaken black's king. Now, there's 3 things I immediately notice. First of all, we have a bunch of pieces staring at the king, right? We have the bishop, we have the knight, we have the queen. That tells me that potentially we can sacrifice one of these pieces and still have enough material left over to give checkmate. The other thing I notice is that there's this pawn on f7 that's pinned by the bishop, which means the g6 square is actually accessible to white's queen. So should I want to, I can give a check on g6. We'll get right back to that in a moment. The third thing I notice is that we have a queen and a knight in the attack. Queen and a knight is basically the most fearsome tandem in all of chess. I think Jose Raul Capablanca, our early world champion from Cuba, was, don't quote me on this, but I think he was the first to sort of draw attention to the fact that the queen and the knight are incredibly fearsome, very, very strong attackers that can produce a lot of mating patterns. So with that in mind, the move knight g5 comes to immediate mind, but the problem there is it doesn't create a threat. And the reason it doesn't create a threat is because this dastardly knight on f6 is guarding the h7 square. So black can simply take our beloved bishop on b3 and we run out of fuel. So let's shift from that to considering checks, captures, and threats, which we really have to do here. I mentioned that is a very elementary piece of advice, but it actually is a very powerful one if and only if you don't try to do any self-selection and you literally look at all of the checks within reasonable limits. I'm not saying queen h7 is something you have to consider for a very long time. Okay, so the first move is, of course, queen g6 check. That seems very tempting, especially because if king f8, we take on f7 with checkmate. The problem is he goes to h8. And if we try to dial, pedal backward with queen h6, then he can even block the check with his knight. And it seems that we've actually done more harm than good because his queen can now jump out to f6. Ugh, not good. What else is there? Well, there's bishop takes f7 check. Now, it might seem counterproductive to give our bishop up for a pawn that's pinned anyway, but let's see what happens if he does that, because what I see is that if king takes f7, then we can actually bring the knight to g5 with check. Okay, the king has two possible retreat squares. He's got king e7. If we look very carefully, the king is all out of squares. We can give queen g7 checkmate in that case. Notice the queen and the knight working together. So the king has to go back to g8. Just to remind you, we're calculating takes, knight g5 check, king g8. Then we can give a check on g6 with the queen, and we've got a very classic mating scenario. If he goes to f8, queen f7 mate. If he goes to h8, then knight f7 mate. So either the knight is sort of the supporting actor, dangling the queen in front of black's queen like a marionette, or the knight itself, the roles are reversed. The knight is the checkmating piece, the queen is the restricting piece. In either case, I think that's a pattern most of you will be familiar with. We can go ahead and execute these moves. Notice what I said at the start actually comes true. We can sacrifice one of the attackers, and we've got enough pieces left over to where they are capable of then finishing the job. And we have yet another position where it's very clear at the outset that both kings are getting attacked. We've got queen, knight, and bishop, as in the last problem here, involved in the attack. And we are down a rook. So preliminarily, it seems to me that the goal for black is going to be to avoid the checks, and there's going to be enough pieces there to give checkmate. I should also point out the queen is under fire, so it would be great if we could move the king onto a square such that the queen cannot move. The problem is that's not possible. We have two moves, king e6, king d6. And against both moves, the queen can capture on a6 with check. So, in these situations when you've got two possible moves, it's important to use the method of comparison and try to understand, rather than going very, very deeply down one of the moves, we can try to kind of look at both simultaneously and figure out, the similarities and differences between them. And maybe we can figure out that one of them has a very clear drawback. So let's start with king e6. Well, probably white's going to take on a6 with check. And then we have to block with our bishop. And immediately I see a big drawback. This bishop on c5 is an integral part of black's attack because it's restricting the king's access to g1. And if white goes h3 to defend against mate, there's a very typical idea where black then goes queen g3, threatening checkmate, forcing white to take the knight. And much like in our first problem, the queen then drops back to h4 with the h file being opened. It is then checkmate. But with the bishop being on d6, the king then can just go to g1. So from an attacking perspective, that seems like a very big concession. So let's move on to king d6. Then if queen takes a6, we actually can block with the other bishop. The other bishop is not integral to the attack. So at least from that point of view, it seems to me that king d6 is the move. Now, there's just no case to be made for king e6. In addition, after king d6, white has no checks other than queen takes a6. After king e6, he's got another check that we have to reckon with, knight c7. So we're going to safely make this move and safely make this move. And that, okay, bishop f4. So he's defending against mate. Well, we can give a check on f2, but that's useless. He's just going to sacrifice in exchange for that. So we have to take the bishop, and our task of avoiding the checks continues. He's given us e5 check. But rather than getting overwhelmed, once again, we just got to go through one by one the possible king retreats and figure out which one is best. Now, my instinct is to move the king back to d7, but I immediately see that he's got just a deadly check on f5 with a bishop. That doesn't look like any good. Although maybe we should extend that calculation. But again, I want to make it very clear that it's important to use, I think the analog in computer science is like breadth first search rather than depth first search. Rather than try to go too deeply down one line, we look at a lot of them superficially to try to figure out if we can rule any of them out. sort of prune our decision tree, and that makes the decision itself a little bit less overwhelming. So let's now look at king takes e5. Okay, well, white has only one check, right? Rook e1 check. And there, my first instinct would be to block the check. So let's say we go bishop e3 to preserve this very important knight on g4. Then, if he goes rook takes e3, well, it looks like we go f takes c3, and it looks like we've escaped the checks. Although, wait a minute, he's got rook f5 check there. Oh gosh, and the attack continues. Okay, so let's put that aside for a second. King e5 is very promising. Let's see if we can't find anything simpler. What if we take the knight first? Well, then he's got two checks, right? He can give us a check with c4, bishop e. If he gives us bishop e4 check, well, then we take on e5, and we use the bishop on e4 as an umbrella to cover our king against the check on the e file. Okay, that leaves him with c4 check. Well, using the method of comparison, we see that if we take on e5 then, it's basically the same position except he's lacking a knight. Surely that's got to be better than taking on e5 immediately, and don't call me Shirley, but the other thing I noticed is after king d5, he's got bishop c4 check. But again, we can take on e5 and block on e3, and that seems to be quite a bit better than taking immediately. I would also point out king e6 allows queen takes c6 check. And it's very important, if you have these 5 or 6 possible moves, that you give all of them a little bit of attention, because you might fall in love with one move and then just forget that there's another move that just ends the problems immediately. But here we see that that is not the case. Boom, boom, problem solved. Okay, so we've got a lot of attacking themed problems here. So again, the king is very, very weak. It seems that queen takes d5, immediate move that we should start by considering. Now, queen takes d5. If the king moves to e7 or e8, the mate is very elementary, queen f7. The issue is queen takes d5, bishop d6. And these situations, as I explained on the previous problem, rather than get overwhelmed and try to think your way to the solution, you just start looking at moves. And in this case, you start looking at checks. Because you're down 2 pieces, you've got a very narrow margin to make something happen. Okay, so queen takes d5, bishop d6. If queen f7 check, we can toss that out immediately because he can block the check with his queen and bring another defender in. So logically speaking, if you do want to use logic, the ideal check would be something that he cannot block. And that would essentially mean diagonal check. So that's queen e6 check and queen f5 check. Let's take a look at queen f5 check first, for no particular reason. Again, if he moves to e7 or e8, well, we got a checkmate, which means he's got to move to c6. This is, again, after takes d5, bishop d6, queen f5 check, king c6. Well, then we have queen b5 checkmate, right? And how did I see queen b5? Well, I just looked at all of the potential checking squares. I see the king is out of squares. Other than d7, can we give a check to block the king's movement to d7? Well, indeed we can. So we can go ahead and execute those moves. So no rocket science here. It's just a matter of going through as many moves as possible. Okay, on to the next one. So, apologies for my hoarse voice. I've been doing a lot of talking today. Now, here it seems, again, the contours of the problem are very clear. Black is up 3 pawns. He's got a passer on a2. We need to checkmate Black's king somehow using the limited resources available at our disposal. So let's reason logically, right? How many squares does the king have? Because there's 2 ways of delivering checkmate. We can either disrupt the mechanism or not. We can either mate the king on f3, or we can shift the king to a different square and mate him there, which is of course much harder. So we should start by asking ourselves if we cannot simply checkmate the king where it is. Well, the king really has only one square, f4. So ideally we would deliver checkmate from the f file, but if we do it from any square other than f2, the king will have the e2 square. So the next question is, can we deliver mate on f2 with this rook? Well, obviously not immediately, he just takes. But can we prepare that move? Well, we sure can. We can go rook g2. We don't care if he makes a queen or a zebra or a purple tiger. We're going to mate him on f2 on the next move. He simply has no checks. Boom, boom, problem solved, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's only been 15 minutes. Let's do one last one. And a very interesting problem this is. So what's going on here? Our queen is under fire. Let's take another sip of water here. Hopefully I can have enough voice left to talk through this final problem. Okay, so our queen is under fire, but immediately we notice that we can take the bishop, right? We can take the bishop on c2. What's his idea? Well, our king is weak, so his idea is clearly to go queen f6 and mate us. And a lot of people would just toss that out there and say, that's not possible. But I like to take a couple more seconds. I call this the 15-second rule. When you're in a position and you're about to stop calculating, force yourself to take 15 more seconds and see if you can't override that instinct to panic because a move looks particularly intimidating. So what I see after queen takes c2, queen f6 is that I can try to intercept that battery, and I can do that in several ways. I can put something on e5, but that gives up the piece, and white's going to end up with a beautiful protected passer on c5. I can go e5, but notice that the queen on f6 can then capture the knight, but I can also go d4, and d4 only gives up a pawn. If he takes with the bishop, then I take the sting out of everything by taking the bishop. If he takes with a pawn, well, I have a tempo, and I can use this tempo to swing my queen from c2 to f5, dislodging white's queen from f6, and ending up with an extra piece, so we can safely go ahead and do this. Yeah, he takes with the bishop, we take back, and the problem is solved. All right, let's keep going. So here we're down a rook, okay? And not only are we down a rook, black is threatening checkmate on b1. So there's a lot of factors that basically can tell us that we need to operate A, by giving checks, and B, it seems clear to me that the only solution here is to somehow deliver checkmate to black's king. Now, there's only one feasible check. We can give a check on f7 with the knight, but he's just going to take. And as I mentioned before, you're solving these problems in order to get better at real games. So if you see a move and you know it's the only move, you don't need to sit there and try to calculate everything out until the end. Okay, you can go ahead and play it. Okay, again, let's take a look at all the checks. Well, f8 queen promotes, but it doesn't help because we've already noticed black's threat. Notice how important it is here to first understand your opponent's threats. It can allow you to rule out a lot of tempting moves. I see also a check on h8, but basically that repeats the whole problem. You just give up one queen, you make another, but after king h7, the queen is tied to the knight on h6, which black will take in the event of any check. Okay, is there any other checks? Well, there is a check, right? We can make a knight. We can make a knight. We can under-promote. And if we make a knight, we send the king further down to h6. Then we can give him another check from h8. Okay, let's calculate. The king has to go to g5. Now that queen from h8 can travel then to h4, delivering a check and stopping the king from escaping to f6. The king has to go to f5. This is a great time to make these moves on your board. Okay, now let's think about that position. Let's visualize it. How do we visualize it? We ask ourselves again, what are the king's possible escape squares? We notice that the knight on f8 defends e6. g6 is blocked by black's own pawn. So that leaves us with e5, and that's it. If we can give a check with the queen to keep all three of these squares under control, it's going to be checkmate. And such a square exists, right? f4. f4 is a square that keeps these squares under control, and white's knight and black's pawn does the rest. Boom, boom, and the problem has been solved. All right, let's do one last one, folks, before my voice permanently disappears. Okay, a situation where both queens are hanging. I love these problems. These problems are generally easier than they seem. When both queens are hanging, the first thing you look for is what's called a desperado sacrifice. A desperado sacrifice is a sacrifice, well, where you give up your queen for as much as you can give it for, with the knowledge that you're then going to take your opponent's queen and have that extra whatever it is you got. Now, that means we need to look at every capture, right? First capture on d5. No, not good, because white's queen captures and black ends up losing the exchange. The joke's on him. Okay, so we can take here, but white takes back, okay, right? So he not only, we got to be careful about that. A lot of people forget about that. They try a desperado sacrifice and they forget that their opponent's queen can actually take that piece and take the queen at the same time. So what else is there? We can take the rook. promising. The queen cannot take d1. We attack the other rook, so white has to attend to that. He's got to take. And then we take the queen. Problem solved. Boom. Boom. And we, ladies and gentlemen, are up a rook. So that was 8 problems that we just knocked out. Now, I will say that sometimes when you're solving problems in this rating neighborhood, you get an occasional problem that's incredibly difficult, and even I have some problems with them. Pun intended, get it? But by and large, you can still use logic, and if your visualization is decent, and you're able to calculate 4 or 5 moves ahead, and you're able to visualize the position, you can use this logic and you can ask the right questions and understand the sort of decision logic that you use to solve each of these problems. And remember, a lot of them, you simply need to plunge in and get your hands dirty. You sort of need to start looking at moves. If you have 3 or 4 king escapes, rather than sitting there and panicking, you use the method of comparison and you just start looking at moves, because sometimes if you compare one move and another move, you reach a key insight if you had made the appropriate observations at the beginning that will then allow you to maybe even take some shortcuts and not calculate everything to the end. Also remember, breadth first search, not depth first search. Sometimes you want to look at a couple of moves superficially and again figure out how they're different rather than going too deeply down one move and taking 30 minutes and getting frustrated when the solution just, laid 2 moves deep in another move. So I hope you folks enjoyed. I might do a follow-up video where I do more problems in this rating range. I might go a little bit higher or lower based on the feedback. Remember, I appreciate all feedback, whether it's positive, whether it's constructive criticism. I want this channel to be the best that it can be, and I want every video to benefit as many players as I can. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I apologize for my slightly hoarse voice today. It's been a long day. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave comments and questions. And if you enjoy the content, I would very much appreciate it if you subscribed. In any case, I will see you in the next video. I'll be doing more problems, and the next opening video on Naroditsky's Gambit Refutations, Busting the Gambits, will appear very shortly as well. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.